The sun, a relentless Richmond summer furnace, beat down on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot as I pulled my Honda Civic into my usual spot. Even at 7 in the morning, the humidity was a thick blanket, clinging to my clothes and promising another long, sticky day. My name is Briar Hayes, and I'm a property manager. Not just any property manager, but one who prided herself on seeing the underlying structures, the hidden wear and tear, the subtle signs of decay before they became catastrophes. I considered myself a problem solver, a fixer, the invisible hand that kept the gears of dozens of residential properties grinding smoothly. My office, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and the faint, lingering scent of various cleaning products, scents I knew intimately, given how often I felt like I was personally scrubbing the grime off Richmond's rental landscape. I handled everything: tenant screenings, lease agreements, maintenance requests, rent collection, evictions. It was a juggling act, a constant tightrope walk between landlords' expectations, tenants' demands, and the cold, hard realities of property wear and tear. My approach was always pragmatic, unsentimental. I saw numbers, contracts, and consequences. Emotions were a luxury I couldn't afford in this business. Most days, I found a quiet satisfaction in the methodical nature of my work. I thrived on order, on efficiency. I was observant, noticing the loose tile in the hallway of the old Victorian on Grove Avenue, the faded paint on the porch of the duplex near Bayard Park, the subtle shift in a tenant's tone that signaled trouble brewing. My job was to anticipate, to mitigate, to enforce. And for years, that's exactly what I did, often going above and beyond. I'd chase down a plumber for a midnight leak, mediate disputes between neighbors, even walk a tenant through the confusing process of setting up their utilities. I was the safety net, the one who always caught them when they stumbled. But lately, that safety net had begun to feel like a trampoline, with tenants bouncing off it higher and higher, demanding more, taking more, and giving less. I had been repeatedly exploited, stretched thin by a growing tide of irresponsibility. It wasn't just a few bad apples anymore. It was a pervasive culture of expecting someone else, usually me, to clean up their self-inflicted messes. I'd seen it all: apartments left in states of unspeakable filth, properties damaged by reckless behavior, rent checks that bounced like rubber balls, accompanied by a shocking lack of remorse. My once pristine apartments, the ones I'd personally overseen every repair and repaint, were now in some cases becoming swamps of neglect. It built up, a quiet fury that simmered beneath my pragmatic exterior. I started to wonder deeply what would happen if I simply stopped intervening. What if I let them face the self-inflicted consequences? The tipping point arrived, not with a bang but with a slow, agonizing drip. It concerned the Westcott Street property, a charming, older house near the Fan District that I had poured my heart and soul into renovating 2 years prior. It had gleaming hardwood floors, fresh paint, and a brand new kitchen. I had meticulously screened the tenants, a young couple named Mark and Chloe. They seemed charming enough, full of promises about how much they loved the place. They were, it turned out, professional exploiters, masters of passive destruction and active evasion. For months, the warning signs had been there. Late rent payments, always followed by elaborate, tearful excuses. Maintenance requests for issues clearly caused by their own negligence. A shattered window they claimed was a stray baseball. A clogged drain overflowing with what looked suspiciously like coffee grounds and cat litter, despite a strict no-pets policy. Each time I'd sigh, my unsentimental nature battling a flicker of exasperation, and I'd send someone out or I'd find a solution, often absorbing the cost or having to fight tooth and nail to deduct it from their security deposit. My job was to protect the properties, and by extension the property owners, and I took that responsibility seriously. But the emotional cost was mounting, the feeling of being constantly taken for granted, of being the endless resource for people who refused to take basic responsibility. Then came the incident of the burst pipe. Not a small leak, but a catastrophic failure in the upstairs bathroom, resulting in a waterfall through the ceiling into the living room below. It was late on a Friday night, almost 9 o'clock. My phone rang, vibrating angrily on my bedside table. It was Chloe, her voice a shrill wail. "Briar, oh my God, the house is flooding, water everywhere, you have to do something." My pragmatic brain immediately kicked into gear. "Have you turned off the main water supply?" I asked, my voice calm even as a knot formed in my stomach. A long pause. "The what?" she replied. "Briar, seriously, it's coming down. Get someone here now." I spent the next 4 hours coordinating plumbers, restoration crews, and navigating insurance paperwork, all while listening to Mark and Chloe's increasingly frustrated calls about their ruined electronics and furniture. When the plumber finally arrived, he found a clear obstruction. A massive wad of what appeared to be fabric softener sheets, paper towels, and hair deliberately stuffed into the toilet. It wasn't an accident. It was gross negligence, a clear violation of their lease, an intentional act of vandalism by proxy. The plumber, a man named Gary I'd worked with for years, shook his head, grimacing as he pulled out the disgusting mass. "Briar," he said, his voice low, "this wasn't a pipe burst, this was sabotage. Someone put this stuff down there." My unsentimental facade almost cracked. A cold, hard anger settled in my chest. When I confronted Mark and Chloe, they feigned shock, then outrage, then tried to blame the old pipes and poor construction. Their lies were flimsy, insulting. They expected me to believe them, to fix it, to pay for it, to make it all go away. Just like always, I hung up the phone after the last infuriating call with Chloe that night, the sound of their fake indignation still ringing in my ears. I sat in the silent darkness of my apartment, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of their irresponsibility, the absolute audacity of their exploitation. For years, I had been the one cleaning up their messes, metaphorically speaking, absorbing the financial hits, suffering the emotional drain of their endless drama. This pipe incident wasn't just a maintenance issue. It was a direct assault on my patience, my professionalism, my very sense of fairness. It was the last straw. Rage wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold, crystalline, and utterly precise. It was in that moment, as the first rays of dawn filtered through my window, that a radical thought, terrifying but utterly compelling idea, bloomed in my mind. The Reddit post I'd stumbled upon months ago, the one about the shared bathroom, suddenly crystallized into a viable strategy. What if I just stopped? Not stopped working, not abandoned my duties, but stopped intervening on their behalf. Stopped being the buffer. Stopped being the one who always rushed in to prevent the consequences of their own choices from fully manifesting. My role as a property manager was to oversee, to facilitate, to enforce the terms of the lease. It was not to be a personal babysitter, nor a bottomless pit of patience and free repairs. My motivation, the quiet promise I made to myself, was clear. I would compel these negligent tenants to confront the mess they had created financially and physically by strategically withdrawing my support. I would force accountability. I would let them sink in the swamp of their own making. This was not about petty revenge, it was about the fundamental principle of consequence, of ownership. This was about finally making them understand that cleaning a swamp sucks way more when you're the only one stuck in it. The question that lingered, sharp and urgent in my mind, was how to execute this strategy with surgical precision, remaining within the bounds of my professional obligations while ensuring the full, unadulterated weight of their negligence crushed them without my interference. How far could I push this calculated inaction before it backfired on me? What would be the true cost of watching them fall, and could I truly remain unsentimental enough to see it through? The stage was set, the ordinary had unraveled, and I was about to embark on a path that would change not only their lives but, I suspected, fundamentally alter my own. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. Act 2, Struggle, the desperation, descent into darkness and continuous progression. The days following the pipe incident at Westcott Street were a strange mixture of calm and simmering anticipation. I moved through my professional life with an outward appearance of normalcy, but beneath the surface, a meticulous, unsentimental plan was unfolding. My first step was to thoroughly review every lease agreement, every clause, every tiny print detail, especially those pertaining to tenant responsibilities, maintenance, and penalties for negligence. I spent hours poring over legal precedents, consulting with our company's attorney Frank under the guise of proactive risk management. I needed to ensure that my calculated inaction would be precisely that, inaction, not dereliction of duty. I wouldn't do anything illegal or unprofessional. I would simply stop doing more than was required, stop covering for their deficiencies. My focus narrowed to the worst offenders, primarily Mark and Chloe at Westcott Street, but also a few other persistently troublesome tenants scattered across my portfolio. These were the ones who habitually pushed boundaries, who thought the lease was a suggestion, who believed property management was a concierge service rather than a contractual agreement. My motivation was no longer just about the pipe. It was about correcting a fundamental imbalance, about creating a painful, unforgettable lesson in personal accountability. My pragmatic nature demanded a foolproof strategy, and my observant eye was now hyper-focused on every misstep they made, every forgotten responsibility. The initial phase was subtle. For Mark and Chloe, their rent was due on the 1st of the month. In the past, when it was late, I'd send a polite reminder on the 2nd, followed by a firmer notice on the 3rd, sometimes even calling them directly to check in. This time I did nothing. The automated system sent the late notice. The late fees, clearly outlined in their lease, began to accrue. My phone, which usually buzzed with their urgent, self-serving demands, remained silent on my end. I ignored their increasingly panicked voice messages, letting them stew in the consequences of their financial irresponsibility. Their frantic messages transitioned from polite inquiries to thinly veiled threats, and finally to desperate pleas, but I remained unmoved. Then came the maintenance requests. The burst pipe had been fixed, but the underlying issue of their destructive habits remained. They started complaining about minor things first: a flickering light bulb, a sticky door, a slow drain in the shower. Things that, while annoying, were clearly tenant responsibilities according to the lease, or very minor issues that I would typically address promptly. My new policy: immediate triage based strictly on the lease and safety. If it wasn't a genuine emergency, fire, major structural damage, critical utility failure, and it was explicitly their responsibility, it went into a separate pile. The flickering light, tenant responsibility, please replace the bulb as per clause 7C of your lease. The sticky door, this is cosmetic wear and tear. You may lubricate the hinges at your own expense. I was polite, professional, but absolutely unyielding. My replies were short, precise, and devoid of the usual empathetic fluff. The frustration on the other end was palpable. I could almost hear Chloe's jaw dropping over the phone. "But Briar, you always send someone for these things," she wailed one afternoon. "My apologies, Chloe," I replied, my voice steady, "but as per your lease agreement, these items fall under tenant maintenance. Please consult your copy for clarification." End call. My unsentimental core held firm. It was oddly liberating, peeling back the layers of excessive care I had provided. The true escalation began when the more significant issues started to pile up, issues directly stemming from their negligence. The original water damage from the burst pipe had necessitated professional drying and remediation, but the ongoing moisture in some unseen cavity, combined with their generally unhygienic habits, led to mold. A faint, earthy smell began to permeate the Westcott Street property. I knew it was there. I'd smelled it on my last brief, necessary inspection. It was a health hazard, yes, but one that was a direct result of their actions and their failure to adequately air out the property or report minor dampness promptly. They sent a maintenance request, claiming a strange smell. My response: the initial water damage remediation was completed. Any new issues must be thoroughly documented by the tenant, including photographic evidence and a detailed account of the source, to determine responsibility for further action. Please refer to Clause 12b regarding tenant-caused damage. My observation of their tendencies told me they wouldn't do the meticulous documentation required. They were too lazy, too used to me doing the heavy lifting. And sure enough, they didn't. The mold continued to grow, a silent, festering consequence of their inaction. The situation spiraled. The garbage disposal in the kitchen, abused and misused for months, finally gave up the ghost. I knew it was from them pouring grease and food scraps down it despite explicit warnings. Their request: disposal broken, needs immediate repair. My reply: we have records of previous education regarding proper disposal use. Given the history of misuse, this repair will be assessed against your security deposit. Please confirm your acceptance of these terms before we schedule a repair. Again, silence. They didn't want to pay. So the broken disposal sat, a growing monument to their irresponsibility, its internal mechanism seizing up and a faint, rancid odor beginning to emanate from the sink. The tension in my office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other property managers, my colleagues, would occasionally eye me with a mixture of confusion and admiration. They'd heard whispers, seen the stack of late notices and neglected repair requests for specific tenants. "Briar, are you sure about this?" One of them, a kind, older woman named Dorothy, asked cautiously one morning, referring to utility shutoff notice for a Westcott Street that had just landed on my desk. "They haven't paid their water bill in 2 months. That's outside our purview to intervene directly, Dorothy. It's their utility account," I replied, my voice calm. "But the property will be affected," she exclaimed, her brow furrowed. "Indeed," I said, leaning back in my chair, my gaze steady. "That is the consequence of non-payment. Not our problem to fix, merely to observe and document." Dorothy sighed, shaking her head. She didn't understand the depth of my motivation, the years of quiet exploitation that had led me to this point. She saw a potentially messy situation. I saw a necessary lesson about to be delivered. My unsentimental logic was impenetrable. It was a heavy emotional toll, resisting the urge to jump in, to rescue, to prevent the inevitable collapse. Every instinct ingrained from years of being the fixer screamed at me to intervene. But I held firm. I kept reminding myself this was not about cruelty, it was about consequence. It was about allowing the natural laws of responsibility to finally take hold. The phone calls from Mark and Chloe became more desperate, laced with a new kind of passive aggression. "Briar, we really need that disposal fixed. It's making the whole kitchen unusable. It's getting pretty unlivable in here, to be honest." I could hear the implied threat, the hint that they might just walk away, leaving a bigger mess. That was a risk I was willing to take. My strategy was already prepared for such an eventuality. As per my last communication, Chloe, the terms for repair are clear. If you find the property uninhabitable due to issues for which you are responsible, you are welcome to refer to the early termination clauses in your lease. Another sharp, deliberate pause. The bait was laid. They didn't take it. They were trapped, caught between their desire for a free ride and the mounting financial and practical discomfort. The rock bottom for them, and the point where my own internal struggle solidified into cold, hard resolve, came when the city health department got involved. The mold, combined with the festering garbage disposal and a general lack of cleanliness, became impossible to ignore. A neighbor, tired of the stench and the visible signs of neglect, had made an anonymous complaint. I received a formal notice. Westcott Street was scheduled for an inspection. I promptly forwarded the notice to Mark and Chloe, along with a reminder of their obligation to maintain the property in a clean and safe condition. No offer to help, no advice on how to prepare. Just the official notice. The day of the inspection arrived. I attended, of course, as the property manager. But I remained a silent observer. I watched as the inspector, a stern woman named Ms. Albright, walked through the property, her face growing increasingly grim. She noted the mold climbing the bathroom walls, the putrid smell from the kitchen sink, the general disarray, the unemptied trash, the sheer accumulation of neglect. Mark and Chloe tried to charmingly deflect to blame hidden issues and Briar's slow response to repairs. My unsentimental gaze met Ms. Albright's, and I simply presented the meticulous documentation I had compiled. Every maintenance request, every reply, every late notice, every clause in their lease outlining their responsibilities. The dates, the times, the specific language, it was undeniable. My records were impeccable. Ms. Albright nodded, her expression softening slightly as she looked at me, then hardening as she turned back to the tenants. The verdict was swift and severe. Multiple code violations, a mandatory order to vacate until the property was brought up to code, and a significant fine levied directly against the tenants for causing the conditions. The cost of remediation, which would now require professional hazardous material removal, would be astronomically higher than if they had addressed the issues promptly. And critically, the lease was now in direct default. Their security deposit wouldn't even begin to cover the damage. The color drained from Mark and Chloe's faces. Their protests were weak, pathetic. They finally understood. There was no one to clean up this swamp but them, and the swamp was now an ocean. I watched their despair, their faces contorting with a mix of fear and anger, and in that moment the years of exploitation, the quiet frustration, the simmering rage, finally found their release in a wave of cold satisfaction. This wasn't just a property issue anymore. This was a complete systematic breakdown of their lives, brought on by their own choices. They were completely helpless, trapped in the web of their own making, and the consuming anger that had driven me to this point began to shift slowly into a resolute calm. The rock bottom for them was a moment of profound revelation for me. My pragmatic orchestration was working. What would be the next step to ensure their complete reckoning? And how would this transformation impact my own future? Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. Act 3. Revenge: The Reckoning, its execution, and the grand payoff. The aftermath of the health department's intervention at Westcott Street was a grim tableau of consequence, and for me, a profound validation of my calculated inaction. Mark and Chloe were served with official notices, their faces pasty white with shock. The fine was crippling, the remediation costs daunting, and the forced evacuation a tangible symbol of their utter failure. My pragmatic orchestrator role shifted from passive observation to active enforcement of the inevitable. There was no going back, no 11th hour rescue. Their swamp was officially condemned by their own doing, and I was merely holding the shovel they had used to dig it. My resolve, once a cold ember, was now a steady flame. Watching them flounder, truly understanding the depth of their self-inflicted misery, had cemented my conviction. This wasn't about malice, it was about justice. It was about teaching a lesson that no amount of lecturing or gentle reminders could impart. It was about reclaiming the dignity of honest work, both mine and that of the property owners I represented. My unsentimental nature allowed me to witness their unraveling without a flicker of pity. I had seen this pattern before, not just with Mark and Chloe, but with countless others who believed they could offload their responsibilities onto someone else. This time the burden was back on their shoulders, crushing them. The eviction process began immediately, as their lease was now in default due to the code violations. Frank, our company attorney, who had initially been cautious about my hands-off approach, now saw the meticulous documentation I had compiled as an ironclad defense. Every email, every text message, every ignored reminder, every lease clause highlighted. It painted a damning picture of tenant negligence and my unwavering adherence to protocol. There was no room for them to claim I hadn't communicated, hadn't warned, hadn't provided opportunities for them to rectify the situation. I had simply stopped intervening beyond my contractual obligations, letting the natural course of their irresponsibility play out. The tenants, desperate, tried one last gambit. They showed up at my office unannounced, uninvited, on a Tuesday morning. Chloe's eyes were puffy, red-rimmed, and Mark looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usual swagger replaced by a defeated slump. They pleaded, they begged, they promised they would change, they would clean, they would pay. They offered to do anything, to sign new agreements, to take on the remediation themselves. Chloe even started to cry, real tears this time, not the performative ones from before. Briar, Mark began, his voice hoarse, we made mistakes. We know that, but we can fix this. Just give us a chance, please. We'll clean the whole place. We'll pay for the mold, just don't evict us. We have nowhere else to go. My gaze remained steady, unwavering. My observant nature picked up the telltale signs, the frantic desperation, the underlying resentment that they had been caught, not genuine remorse. Their offer to fix this was too little, too late. Mark, Chloe, I said, my voice calm, almost clinical, the process has been initiated. The health department has issued a vacate order and your lease is in default. The fines are levied and the remediation costs have been assessed. These are the direct consequences of your failure to maintain the property according to the terms of your lease and city code. My role is to enforce those terms, not to absolve you of them. But you could have helped us. Chloe wailed, fresh tears streaming. You always did before, you could have told us what to do. I allowed myself a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of my head. My communications were always clear, Chloe. I provided the information, the clauses, the expectations. It was your responsibility to act on them. I am a property manager, not your personal caretaker. My function is to manage the property, not to manage your lives. You chose to ignore your responsibilities, and now you must confront the mess you created financially and physically. The property will undergo comprehensive remediation, and the costs, along with the accrued back rent and legal fees, will be pursued to the fullest extent permitted by law. Their faces crumpled. There was no more fight left in them. They understood I was not their rescuer. I was the mirror reflecting their own negligence back at them full force. They left my office without another word, their shoulders slumped, the weight of their choices finally crushing them. It was a grand payoff, not in a spectacular explosion, but in the quiet, absolute defeat of those who had exploited my kindness for so long. The triumph wasn't loud, it was deeply satisfying. The execution of the revenge continued, relentless and methodical. The property remediation company I hired was top-tier, efficient. They gutted the affected areas, removed all traces of mold, and rebuilt. The costs were astronomical, far exceeding the Westcott security deposit. Their credit was destroyed, their names now red flags in every tenant screening database in Richmond. They were evicted, forced to find temporary housing, likely in far less desirable conditions, paying exorbitant rates because of their ruined rental history. They were stuck in their swamp. For other negligent tenants in my portfolio, the ripple effect was palpable. The word got out. The story of Westcott Street, embellished and exaggerated by the grapevine, spread like wildfire. Suddenly, maintenance requests were accompanied by photographs, descriptions were detailed, and tenants were proactively addressing minor issues before they escalated. Rent checks started arriving on time. There was a newfound respect, a quiet acknowledgement that Briar Hayes was not to be trifled with. My unsentimental approach, once seen as cold, was now viewed as undeniably effective. It wasn't about being mean, it was about being clear, about establishing firm boundaries. My superiors, who had initially eyed my method with trepidation, were now impressed. The Westcott property, once a liability, was being professionally restored and would soon be ready for new, responsible tenants. The legal costs, while significant, were recoverable from Mark and Chloe, and more importantly, the precedent set was invaluable. Our properties collectively began to show fewer signs of tenant-induced neglect. My reputation, far from being tarnished, was enhanced. I had demonstrated a powerful, if unconventional, way to enforce accountability. The resolution for me was not a burst of joy or a celebratory dance. It was a profound, quiet peace. The gnawing frustration, the feeling of being taken advantage of, had finally subsided. I had proven to myself, and to a select group of the most egregiously irresponsible tenants, that consequences, when allowed to unfold unchecked, are the most potent educators. I had reclaimed my time, my energy, and my professional boundaries. The emotional toll of constantly intervening had been replaced by the quiet strength of unwavering resolve. I was still pragmatic, still observant, still unsentimental, but now with an added layer of conviction, a steel core forged in the fires of their self-destruction. In the end, it was a subtle twist of fate that truly cemented the depth of this revenge. Months after the Westcotts had vanished from my professional life, I was at a local coffee shop waiting for my usual black Americano. I overheard a conversation at the next table. It was Chloe, her voice hushed, frantic. She was on the phone, trying to explain to someone, likely a potential landlord, why her rental history was so abysmal. She was trying to spin the story, blame the unforeseen circumstances, and a really difficult property manager who refused to help. She used my name. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the rich, bitter flavor a perfect complement to the scene unfolding before me. I didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her. My heart didn't race, my blood didn't boil. There was just a quiet, profound understanding. She was still stuck in the swamp, trying desperately to explain away the stench of her own making, unaware that the person who had quietly, precisely engineered her predicament was sitting just feet away, enjoying her coffee. She was forced to confront the mess, not just physically, but every single day, as she tried to rebuild her life from the ashes of her irresponsibility. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying consequence of all. Sometimes, the most powerful form of justice isn't about what you do to someone, but about what you simply stop doing, allowing them to finally face the unfiltered truth of their own actions. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.